Well, we started this Fireside Chat with the keynote speaker a number of years ago, mainly because there's an opportunity to go beyond the speech and really to talk about business philosophy, but also a little bit behind the personal story behind the speaker. Seifi is an exceptional example of that because he's had quite a personal history in his childhood and so forth. So we'll touch a little bit on that, but then move back into the business side. So before we talk about the business career and what you did at Rockwood and now at Air Products, I'd love to talk a little bit about your personal history, which I learned because we've been friends for a long time. You know, as everyone knows, you were originally from Iran, and you were born in the town of Masad. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your early childhood and also your family and your education. I understand you went to a special school that was funded by one of the international oil companies operating in Iran. Maybe you could share a little bit about your early childhood.
Sure, I'd be delighted to do that. I was, as you said, I was born in Iran, in the northeastern part of the country. My father was a university professor, and we were four brothers. I was the oldest one. I went to elementary school there and high school until grade 10. Then at that time, I was about 14 years old. The oil companies, this is 1950s, the oil companies that were operating or managing the oil in Iran were a combination of Standard Oil of New Jersey and BP and Royal Dutch Shell and all that. And they were under a lot of pressure from the government to have indigenous Iranians in the oil company management. Obviously, they told the government, well, we can't just catch people from the street and make them managers. We need to educate these people. So they had set up a special school right at the refinery in Iran, which was at that time the largest refinery in the world, in Abadan, 400,000 barrels a day. And they would take people when they are about 14 years old in a school which was 8 years. So it was equivalent of 4 years of additional high school and 4 years of college. But they would select 30 people a year, and we all lived in a dorm, so 30 times 8 was 250 people. And the school was all in English from day one. And you would go through an intense amount of education in humanities, and then enough engineering so that you knew what a refinery is, but not too much that you couldn't sit down and actually design the fractionating tower. But you understood that. So they had it was a program, they paid for everything, and then once you graduated, you had a guaranteed job, so it was very popular. So at the year that I went to, they had something like 6,000 applicants, and they had a very intricate process of choosing the people. So I got selected as one of the 30. I was lucky, and then I went to that school. And then I graduated in 1966 from that school. It was great. I had a very good time there. And then I was lucky. I graduated on top of the class, so they offered to send me abroad to get a PhD and come back and be a professor at that school. I didn't want to do that for two reasons. One is I didn't want to be a professor, but second thing was that Abadan is right on the Persian Gulf. It gets to 120 degrees in the summer.
That's a good reason.
Exciting place to live for the rest of your life. So I went to my father, who was not a rich man, middle class, and I told him, I said, look, support me for one semester, and then I'm on my own. So I applied to different schools. My father had PhD from France. He wanted me to go there, but I wanted to come to America. I applied to different schools. I had good grades, so I got into MIT and Caltech and Stanford, and then I got the brochures, and MIT had sent me this beautiful picture of Boston with the snow. And Stanford was this beautiful beach with a guy with a surfboard. It wasn't a difficult decision, so I decided to go to Stanford. And after one semester, I did get a scholarship, so I wasn't dependent on my father. And I stayed at Stanford for about 4.5 years, and in that 4.5 years, got my master's, I worked on my doctorate in engineering, and then I went to the business school, I went to the law school, I did everything, and then I met my current wife. She's an American lady from Brooklyn that you have
Well, I've met. Lovely person.
And we are now married for 45 years. So then I decided to go take a job, and we got a very nice job in San Diego. And I was working, and I was very happy. Paid $20,000 a year in 1970, which was a lot of money at that time.
Yeah.
But then in 1971, my wife encouraged me that, well, I want to see where you are from, and let's go to Iran and see what happens. If things work out, they work out. If they don't work out, we can always come back.
Now, that's very unusual, because usually
Yeah.
that's not something that a wife says, let's
Right,
go to your home country, right?
Especially,
Especially
if you are a nice Jewish lady from Brooklyn. I managed to marry an unusual person. She's the best thing which has ever happened to my life.
By the way, we do have at least two things in common, right? One is I was supposed to get MIT but didn't, and you didn't get MIT, which my parents never forgave me for going to Yale instead of MIT. And the other is your wife and my wife come from very similar backgrounds, as you know. So we have at least, maybe those are the only two things in common. We have something in common.
That's great. But anyway, so we did go back, and then for 3 years I did end up teaching at the university. Teaching heat transfer, fluid mechanics, and all of those kind of good things. But then in 1973, as you know, oil prices went through the roof, and huge amount of income coming into the country, and the Shah was very interested in industrializing the country, and that was the right thing to do. And for him, industrialization meant steel. No, we need to have a steel company. So he took the president of the university, made him the chairman of the steel company, and he liked me, so I was the #2 employee of the steel company. And the first day I went to his office, I said, the irony of this is that between the two of us, we don't know the difference between a pellet and a billet, and now given the job of running a steel company. But we grew the company from the two of us to about 300,000 people by 1979. And we started building these big plants, and I ended up, because my boss became the minister, and I ended up at age 35 running this company, which is probably the biggest job I'll ever have. Because we were talking about a huge amount of money. It was the biggest industry after the oil company did. So life was great. We had got people from 100 different countries building these giant plants, and I was having a lot of fun doing that. But then the world changed, as you know, and some of us didn't think that anything will happen, because we were arrogant enough to sit down and say, how can a bunch of uncivilized, bearded, unwashed mullahs take over the country? But they did. But once they did, that wasn't the place for me. I had a very difficult time getting out of there, because I actually had to escape, because...
Now, your wife and child were already out, but then you
that
were
was
behind,
the only part that I was lucky, because if they were not, we would have all been killed.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't have escaped.
Yeah.
But I had to literally walk out of there on foot. Took me about 6 months to do that. They don't like people like us. I mean, they have killed about 2 million people. Anybody who has more than high school education is not good enough. And they don't believe in putting people in jail. They say, oh, you're against us, you're against God. If you're against God, you should die. It's very simple process. But but fortunately, I was lucky, very lucky, because if you count 100 of my friends, probably I was 2 out of the 100 who survived. But then I got myself to Europe. My wife hadn't heard from me for about 6 months. But she came, and we went to the American embassy. They were very nice. They knew who I was. I got a visa, came to the US, and started from scratch with borrowing $1,000 from my father-in-law to buy pots and pans and start a life, and but it worked out.
You know, I have a few friends who grew up in Iran before the revolution and so forth, and they have some very, very distinct memories and feelings about the impact they had. Are there some things that you can think of, you know, from that experience and grow up in Iran? And Iran was a very different country before the revolution, which is that's a very sad part of the story, right? Which was, it was a, so vital. Any comments about the influence that your upbringing in Iran has on sort of you today and your career?
Yes, I think the event in Iran, my upbringing, I was very lucky. I had a very happy childhood, maybe a very stable family and all that kind of stuff. But my experience with what happened in Iran, the most important thing is that situations are not as stable as you think. And that applies to companies too. Sometimes you say, how can a company which has been around for, how can GM go bankrupt? They can. Yeah. And it can happen just like that. Right. And everybody was sitting in Iran, me included, saying, my God, here we have the imperial government, the military, F-16s, F-15s, how can this thing fall apart in 2 months? But it did. So you always have to keep your eyes on the ball about how stable the organization is and never underestimate that. That's one thing. The second thing is that in my experience, it gives you a little bit of, you become fearless. Because everybody I've worked for said, don't threaten about firing me because nothing can be worse than what I went through, so I'm not worried about that. It gives you a little bit more self-confidence to be able to deal with situations.
My father, when I was growing up, he went through a lot of dramatic changes like you. I won't go into detail, and survived them. But when I asked him, what's the most important advice you give, and I expected he would say, well, good education and so forth. He said, the fact of the matter is the world changes, and changes dramatically. And he explained that, a number of massive changes happened in his life. So he said, you should assume that there will be big disruptions in your life. If you're lucky, it won't happen, but it is likely to happen. And so you should manage your life so that you can survive those changes and marry a woman who, in fact, will make it through the changes with you. And it sounds like that.
That's always good advice.
Yeah.
It's always a matter of luck. Yeah. Sometimes you get lucky.
Now, there's one part that you skipped in your career before you came back, and that was, which I did some homework here, and that is that when you came out of school, you actually worked on the development of a steam-powered automobile, working for William Lear, right? Who was really the guy who developed Lear jets. So, you've left out in a very important part of your career.
I didn't want to take too much time, but now that you brought it up. I'm at Stanford. I've gotten married. Now you want to kind of have a life. So I apply for jobs, and here is this guy, Bill Lee, who had just sold his airplane company to Gates Rubber. It ended up with millions of dollars. And he offered me twice what everybody else offers. So I go work, but I go for an interview, and then I'm here at this time, I'm about 25 years old. I love planes. And this guy has he has his own Learjet, and he puts me in the co-pilot seat and goes for a ride. I was going to take the job.
And he didn't even tell you what the salary was yet at that point, right?
So I had a great time working for him, but what he was determined to do, which was, his idea was that internal combustion engine creates a lot of pollution because the combustion in the piston is not complete. Yeah. So you get a lot of NOx. But if you have a steam-driven automobile, in the boiler, you have complete combustion. Right. So our CO2 comes out. Therefore, why don't we go and make a steam-powered automobile? So we tried to make that happen. We designed the engine. I designed the boiler. I have a patent on that. So we could fit everything. He wanted to fit everything into a race car that was been in Indianapolis. So we kept saying, look, we can design the boiler. We can design the engine to do 700 horsepower and fit it in a race car. But for God's sake, there is no way you can have a radiator that would condense this amount of steam. So we kept talking to him about, let's make a bus. Because the bus has a lot of room, but he didn't want to have anything to do.
A lot less sexy, right?
So after a while, I got frustrated with that. I went and took the job in San Diego.
Now, back to your regular career. So when you came back, you started at BOC, right? Which in fact, so not everyone knows that in fact you had a long career in
Yeah, about
in
20 years.
20 years in BOC.
Yes.
How about that transition? Because now you know you had worked steam engine, but then it's steel, right? And now, how did that happen?
Well, that experience was actually quite interesting because I wanted to get a job in the United States which was very low visibility because these crazies, you never knew, you get a high visibility job, they can't kill you here. So I was very interested to have a low visibility job at the time. So I ended up getting this job with BOC, with their division, which was located in a place that Scott is very familiar with, which is in the middle of nowhere, called St. Mary's, Pennsylvania. It's a town of 700 people. So I go from being the job that I had, so getting a project engineer job and bring my family to this town of 700 people. Quite a culture change, quite honest. But we had a good time, very good people, and we were very welcome, and it was very, very nice, and my son had a great time, and we really enjoyed ourselves. It wasn't much of a difficult thing. But then, I went through the ranks pretty soon, and then moved to Pittsburgh, and then back to New York.
Now the next big change was you were becoming the CEO of Rockwood, right? Tell me how that experience, and of course that's very different because Rockwood was a private equity owned company. Talk about that transition and what it was like. And in many ways it was very different, right?
That is actually, that was a real change. The way it came about was that I was, with DOC, and then I'd gone this big company, GKN, $12 billion company. And then and I was using this gentleman at Corn Ferry to be hiring people from us. Mm-hmm. So one day he calls me and he says, "You have to go see Andy Kraft." I said, "Why do I need to do that?" He said, "No, just go see the guy." I said, "Why?" He said, "Believe me, you should do that." So he organizes that. And then I went, talked to him, and I was very impressed with the way they were thinking about creating value, which is within the lines of what I was talking about. So that was it. I didn't hear anything, but then 2 months later, they said that, "Well, you might have a job." Mm-hmm. It took me literally 9 months to decide because at the time, the company that they were proposing for me to run was $750 million a year of sale. And I was CEO of a $12 billion company. So it's kind of, the scale is very different. Mm-hmm. So it took me 9 months to go through the process because I wanted to meet everybody at the firm, which they were very welcoming, and I wanted to really understand how it, but I got convinced that if I really want to have an impact and create some real wealth for myself, this was the right thing to do. It was, my father-in-law was saying, "You're crazy." And I was telling, "Look, it is a high-risk deal because you're taking a big, here you have a very comfortable job and all of that. You take a big risk, but the reward is big." And the person who encouraged me the most was my wife. He says, "You can't do it, go do it." And so I took the job, and it was a different experience. I had a lot of time to run the company because I didn't have to spend half of my time like I do right now, going and meeting investors and making presentations and all that. So you had a lot of time to actually run the company. And they were very good because they said, "Look, you perform, we give you the money to expand." Because my deal with them was that, "Look, I want to take this thing and make it a multi-billion-dollar company and take it public." And I said, "No, you perform, we back you up." And they did. And the other thing that I asked was that I said, "Look, don't change people on me. I mean, you have 4 people on my board, don't change them because I don't want to re-explain the strategy." And believe, from the day I started until the day I finished, the same 4 people from KKR were on my board, which was very, very helpful. But then we took the company from 750, made it into a $5 billion company, and I was very happy to write Henry a note saying that the EBITDA of the company is now more than the sales from the day we started. But it was a different experience, but it taught me a lot, quite a bit. It taught me about the fact of what matters, that that substance is what matters, not form. If you have board meetings, the board meeting, if it can be done in 5 minutes, it's done in 5 minutes. You don't have to have a 3-day board meeting. And talk about what matters, decisions are made quickly, go do it. And everything is online. I really enjoyed that. And quite honestly, sometimes I miss it. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to do Air Products, run it that way.
You know, it's interesting because you started out when Rockwood was a private company for a long time, and then there was this decision, right? Because private equity firms, you know, they need liquidity. They don't keep it forever. And tell us about the choice to go public rather than sell. And in fact, eventually, you know, KKR was able to sell their shares over time as a public company. Maybe explain why the decision was made to go public, which, by the way, very few chemical companies can go public, so it's not a given, it's not a biotech company, right? But
you're very right. That was a very important decision because by 2005, we had grown the company to about $3.5 billion, $4 billion. It was a very good company, very profitable company. You could sell it. But my point was that, look, there is more value to be created. But I did understand the desire of the private equity that at some time they have to cash in. Yeah. But the deal that we made, which I really appreciate, was that we take the company public, but the money that we raise, don't take it out. Let me delever. Because we were operating at 7 times leverage as a private company, which is nothing wrong with that. I mean, but when you become public, if you're 7 times leverage, nobody will buy our stock. But we took the money from the IPO and paid down debt. And that gave us room to continue to grow the company. And then after about 5 years, in 2010, then KKR decided to sell their shares. They sold their shares at $40. I told them that, well, you know, you're leaving some money on the table, but that's the decision. And then obviously, then 4 years later, they sold the company for $85.
Yeah. But they still did well. I know, I've talked to Todd and those guys, and they still feel they did well.
No, this is public information. Their cost base in our company was $14 a share. So when they sold it at 40, they made
it was fine. Exactly. Next to last question. So now, you know, Rockwood, you know, was sold, you engineered all of that and so forth. Now you're on the board of, you know, Air Products. There's the shareholder activists and so forth. How did you end up then becoming the CEO? Tell that story.
Well, that story is actually very interesting because I had no idea who Bill Ackman is, and I hadn't heard from him at all. So in September of 2013, I got a call from them that we are going to kind of have a shareholder fight with the proxy, and we need some candidates to be on the board. We would like to propose you as one of them. I said, sorry, I don't do that. I don't want to be part of a fight with a company and so on. I'm not interested. But then a month later, I got a call and said, no, we want to settle with the company. And they have agreed to put 2 people that we would recommend on the board. I said, well, that's a different story. But I will do it if the board asks me. And then the board of Air Products asked me to join, so I said, fine. I joined the board, and then I was part of the selection committee to find the best CEO, and I managed to do it.
You didn't have a supermajority vote on the committee, did you? Well, it's been a happy story for everyone since. And,
no, I'm delighted to be where I am, and a great group of people, a great company, and they have a great future. And it's a good experiment to see how you can take a traditional public company and try to run it as if you're running a private company. So it's a good experiment.
Last question, I'd like to step back and really ask a more macro question. And that is, you know, obviously the chemical industry, like many industries, right, is going through a number of structural changes, but also macro challenges and opportunities. Let's face it, there are challenges, but also opportunities, such as, you know, shale gas became an opportunity. So it's not all negative. You know, what do you think, you know, what would you cite as the key kinds of macro and structural changes that you think CEOs in the industry, public or private, right, should be focused on? And what do you think the CEOs should do to either take advantage of opportunities or defend against some of these threats?
The question that you're asking me is very relevant. Scott was with me. We had a meeting with some of our investors, and we got into this very question. I believe very strongly that the key thing that the CEOs need to do right now is to achieve absolute operational excellence in the company. Because if you are running the company with the minimum amount of cost and reducing your costs, restructuring the company, and you have a business which is running perfectly, then you can survive in the worst of circumstances. And then everything else is great. If you have growth, good, then you make more money. If there are acquisition opportunities, you do them. But if you don't have a company that structurally is not run very well, people are committed, then you can't do anything else. So right now, all of us, I think, there is no growth, there will not be growth for a while. There is all kinds of totally unpredictable events that can happen in the world that can significantly change everything. We need to focus on operational excellence. Take the hell out of the cost, focus on your core business, and run the ship as well as you can, and then you can survive any storm. And a lot of companies that they come and start talking about M&A and I'm going to do this and that, and don't address the actual core of the company, they are not going to last, because that would be my advice.
Well, thank you very much, Seifi.